Right.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. With me today is a whole team of people to discuss the latest issue of the magazine, which is all about sieges. And with me today are Mark DeSantis, Murray Dahm, Lindsay Powell, Mark McCaffrey, and Mike Cole. It's a big topic, and we have a lot of questions. So I think I'm just going to pick one and throw it up in the air, see who catches it. Let's start talking because he's mentioned twice. It's one fun aspect that goes with sieges is siege equipment and sort of defensive siege equipment. And the most famous one of those are, of course, the devices that Archimedes is supposed to have developed to help defend Syracuse. Who wants to? I think we talked about it before in the past in the magazine. Who wants to take a punt at that? Nobody does. This is a smooth one.
Well, I think there's been some. Sorry, you go, Mike.
This isn't quite an answer to the question, but I always am wary of. I brought up when we were pre-gaming for this, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Hellepolis, which is the city-destroying siege tower that Demetrius Poliorcetes supposedly built to take on Rhodes in the Hellenistic era. These kinds of dramatic things, Archimedes, defensive engines, they kind of raise my alarms for things like Hellenistic myth-making. They seem so spectacular and so complex. And also the way they're constructed in the narrative on a dramatic arc, and I say this as a novelist, you see a lot of playing fast and loose with narratives in Hellenistic reporting. So I always get wary of it. And let me contrast this with siege reporting of defensive measures that I would consider to have much more have the ring of truth. And this is Thucydides' description of Archidamus's siege of Plataea. I believe this is in the 5th century BC, if folks remember. And there is a very, very intimate description of the leapfrogging of attack and defense. The attackers build a siege ramp. The defenders mine, the mound of earth underneath it. The attackers deploy rams. The defenders deploy wood and reed partitions to break the rams. The reason that this reporting has a greater ring of truth to me, it's not spectacular. It's very simple. It also mirrors other reports of sieges instead of being singular, right? These are defenses. Putting in a reed and wood partition to block ram heads, I mean, we see that again and again and again all the way through into the Middle Ages. Under countermining a siege mound, that's not exactly new tech here. So it bears the ring of truth. It's a lot less spectacular, but I think that kind of reporting gets us a lot closer to the kinds of defensive measures that you're going to see deployed during a siege. And in this one discussion, again, this is Thucydides' discussion of the siege of Plataea by the Spartans under Archidamus. It's going to give you details, I think, that are going to be a lot more reliable than ship droppers or stuff like that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one because Archimedes is obviously spectacular, as you say, and there have been modern Mythbusters episodes to try and
multiple
build the mirrors to see if they can do what Archimedes' inventions are reputed to have done, and they couldn't. With modern technology, they couldn't do it. So they're, of course, then turning around and saying it couldn't be done in the ancient world. And the drills and the lifters and all of those sorts of things that sound phenomenal, but don't seem to be able to be invented with the technology that they had to hand. But again, it's Archimedes, so there's always that doubt that we understand what he could have achieved. And I think one of the other things is the tragic arc of that story is, of course, that when the Romans enter the city, he's working out a problem and he's killed by a soldier who doesn't appreciate who he is. So there's a wonderful narrative arc, a fictional, possibly, narrative arc to Archimedes' whole death in Syracuse.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to. We've had an article in the past specifically about the mirrors, and if I'm not mistaken, the mirrors are actually mentioned in something like a 5th century book, and not earlier. And so there's this early machinery that is mentioned, and then the mirrors come in 7 centuries later, and I don't think anybody thinks that story is anything but something to make the punters read an extra interesting story. But the rest,
yeah, I think Aeneas Poliorcetes, Aeneas Tacticus, as he's known, he has a lot of low tech, to the point of throwing a bee's nest into the trenches of your attackers, which is like, oh, that is harsh. But again, yes, they're mines, they're counter mines, and in fact, most of his material on how to survive a siege is how do you keep an eye on your own population within the city, because they're going to betray you. And so it's a really interesting siege mentality, if you like, of them building a ramp, them building a tower, them undermining your walls is all well and good, and here's some solutions. But what you've got to really worry about is fifth columnists within your own city who are going to try and.
I'm glad you brought that up, Murray. This is a point I often make, is that Brasidas, the great hero of Sparta. Sorry, I keep harping on classical and Hellenistic Sparta just because that's where my brain's been much recently. Is he's lionized as this hero of the Peloponnesian War, and when you dig into what he actually did, especially in his northern campaigns around Olynthus, is he got people to betray their cities and open the gates to the Spartans. That's what he did. That's the lion's share of his victories are achieved without striking a blow. I agree, and I think it's a really good point that any effective siege defense needs to be guarding against fifth columnists. That's a great point.
Well, I mean, one of the great things about Brasidas is he convinces all of those cities that Sparta will be a better lead, a better boss to them than Athens would, which, of course, most of our sources for it are Athenian. So there's sort of an incredulity in the sources going, well, weren't they gullible? You're like, yeah, I think he might have been right, to be honest. The Spartans aren't going to vote to massacre your entire male population, are they? Anyway.
Well, Aeneas sort of dovetails nicely to Shawshank's question. How did generals go about acquiring the details necessary for siege tactics? Murray, I think that's like a gimme for you.
Yeah, I think it's, again, I think what Mike was saying, that there are things you do. You build platforms, you build ramps, you build towers, rams, ladders, and you try and take the city. But there's also, you communicate with someone who has a, uncle on the 13th tower. You go and have a chat to them in the middle of the night, or, you send messages into the town via secret messaging systems and try and betray the city. You look for weak points. So I think all of these are sort of self-evident, but there probably are. I mean, Aeneas Tacticus is written, we think, in around the 360s BC. So it's a handbook on that. There's 7 other books that are referred to. So there's those sorts of things. There are, of course, historical accounts of sieges. Weirdly, of course, most of the ancient generals would have read Homer first. And, of course, Homer, especially the Iliad, is a siege, but not a siege in our sort of understanding. There's no towers in Homer. There's camping out in your enemy area and becoming a pest. But there's no assaulting the walls in the traditional sense of what we understand as a siege.
That's a funny thing that you're saying that, because actually, if you look at most of the sieges in the ancient world, I mean, we immediately go to the sieges that have great, engineering feats that are, real eye openers and whatnot. And you talked about Plataea being this great success for the Spartans in 428, but of course, actually, that's the one lone effort in terms of besieging a city that the Spartans actually undertake, and it isn't even a success. So it's subsequently, for most of the time, the Spartans avoid any siege work and go for, as you say, the Brasidas approach. You've got the Athenians who have got this great reputation as the besiegers of the Greek world, but of course they don't actually use any siege work equipment. They basically, surround a city and try to starve them out, or alternatively with their ships. I mean, most of their power is around the Aegean, and therefore they're focusing on island states. So therefore they can, establish a blockade. So that in terms of siege work, they're not, most of the sieges that we talk about actually aren't your great, glorious siege works with the towers and the rams and et cetera, et cetera.
So to answer the question directly, I think one of the vectors that the commander has to consider is how much time does he have? What are his resources? Right. So to extend from Mark's point just there, I mean, if you're going to expend energy building all of the stuff, you have to have materials. It's going to cost you time and effort to do that. On the other hand, if you don't want to do that and you have the luxury of time, you can sit it out. And I think there's a famous quote from one siege, forgive me, I forget what it is, where the commander basically says, how long is this going to take? And he says, 10 months, then we'll take it in the 11th, to paraphrase. So there's this calculus that goes on. I mean, it's seal them up or actually assault them.
Well, that's if you can get them to wait. If you take Alexander, of course, he gets his siege equipment ready for Thebes. It supposedly takes 5 days to get the stuff ready. By the fifth day, he's had enough and he goes in without it.
So, case in point, for example, the assumption is that the assumption with Masada, for example, is that this thing took weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and months and months and months. But somebody made an analysis that part of the problem is if you've actually got that series of Roman legions and auxiliaries actually encamped around in the middle of the Dead Sea zone, which is a desert, water becomes a major gating issue. So you've actually got to ship water in, potable water, because the water in the lake you can't drink. So, in fact, what that tells you is the siege has to be expedited. They've got to do it very quickly. So it may have been over in a matter of a couple of months.
A good example for your timing point, Lindsay, which I thought of immediately, was the Lamian War. This is Leosthenes defeating Antipater at Thermopylae. He shuts up the Macedonians in Lamia, and the siege takes so long that Antipater is able to be reinforced from troops returning from Alexander's campaigns in Asia. And it undoes the whole war, which was in favor of Athens at that point. And Athens loses their independence. The whole war's lost literally from the point you've described, that the siege, they were unable to complete it in insufficient time.
Well, even Alessia, Caesar, that's a close run thing with the relief army. I think the other thing, of course, of talking about all those things, when we think of the great sieges, and I know that Mark's going to talk about the siege of Tyre, but when we think about Demetrius, the city taker, most of the stuff we concentrated on is the siege of Rhodes in 305, 304 BC, which didn't succeed. All these amazing, siege towers on ships and all of this, and it doesn't work. It's a fascinating kind of like, we read about this, 40 stories or however many that are in the Heliopolis, and it's like, what? That's craziness, and it doesn't work. They sink, they get turned aback. They're not this undefeatable city-taking device. The siege of Halicarnassus is basically accelerated from two phalangites getting drunk and having a bragging to one another that they could take the city single-handed. Oh, really? Could you? Yeah, I could. Well, come on, show me then. Which is very similar to drunken people throughout history. And they then basically, they then go, right, well, show me. Off they go to take Halicarnassus by themselves, and then that escalates to the point that they almost take the entire city through a drunken,
Apollo and Vorenus
bragging contest.
Apollo and Vorenus have something similar.
Yes, I think so. I think they might have read some Alexander, some Arian.
Got themselves in trouble, and when it comes to the speed of building things, several people are asking about that, and it possibly fits into what Lindsay was saying. Do we have any idea? I mean, presumably, if you have several tens of thousands, or maybe just several, let's say one legion, you have 5,000 men available to work pretty much day and night. You'd think something can go real quick, but I don't think. Do we have any recent examples that we could use to compare how quick that might go?
Well, Siege of Jerusalem started 14th of April 70, ended on the 8th of September 70. 4 months, 3 weeks, 4 days. But they had at their disposal some enormous number of people. It was 70,000 people? Huge.
I think probably one of the best ones is Caesar's bridging of the Rhine. How rapidly he can do that in terms of a rapid engineering operation, which of course is what most sieges are going to be. that they can actually do the building, the digging, the very, very quickly, provided that the material is around. Again, the idea of building siege equipment in a region without wood is, well, that's nigh on impossible. You're going to need to find a different way of doing it, or bring the wood with you if you know that you're going to be operating sieges. And I think that you're probably dealing there with templates of this is what we need for a siege engine. We need these shaped trees so we can build this kind of machine, which is probably another reason why those things are so rare. A ram is a much simpler affair, even though it does require forward planning of casting in bronze and things like that. But I think that you need to have forethought as to whether you're going to be having sieges with you.
The good example of that is, again, looking to Alexander, and of course his campaign against, I think it's Miletus, which he's besieging at the time, I think, and he decides that whilst the siege is going on with Miletus, he's going to head inland and attack a couple of cities, and of course takes off without his besieging equipment, supposedly, because he thinks that with Miletus nullified, then there's going to be just a series of submissions to him in the cities in the hinterland and whatnot. And of course, as soon as they find out that he hasn't got his besieging equipment with him, they all shut their gates. So
we also have Thucydides' report in 425 BC of the Spartans rushing to deal with the Athenian epitaesma, the forward operating base that Demosthenes establishes at Pylos. And they're unable to assault the heights, Demosthenes' fort on the heights, because they didn't have time to build scaling ladders or to bring scaling ladders. When you think of how simple a ladder is, that's kind of hard to believe. But when you see the heights that they had to assault, I was just there in December, it makes sense. You would need, there'd need to be some work to develop scaling devices to get up there.
I think the other vector, which is always in the background, is the seasons, right? You don't start the sort of siege warfare until the spring, and you want to get it over by the early onset of fall or autumn, because you don't want to be besieging somebody in the middle of winter.
Well, that's again one of the reasons why Sphacteria happened so quickly, is because the campaigning season's at the end. They've got 420 hoplites, including probably about 270 citizens on the island itself, and they're basically keeping them there by patrolling them with boats. So it's a land siege of encamp in their territory, but on water. So the only resupplying of the island that can happen is by helots who are offered their freedom if they basically do a suicide mission to swim to the island or to crash their boats into the seaward shore, which several of them do. So that's a siege of an island to starve them out, but they eventually have to land on the island to get rid of them, because the season is coming to a close. And Cleon says, I can get this done without using a single Athenian soldier additional to what Demosthenes already has. And I think one of the points is that when they conquer on Sphacteria, the Spartans still have food supplies left, because they're so disciplined and rigorous that they, even though they were starving and have had 72 days without resupply, they have food left over because they're so used to living without, which again might tie into the whole myth of Spartan discipline. But
I don't. It's not about sieges, so I won't.
That's what the sources say.
Yeah.
So in all these operations, do we know whether they had siege engineers? Some specialists?
Sure. For sure. Yeah, there's that is spoken to abundantly. I'm sorry, Murray and I keep going back to classical Greece because I guess that's our stomping ground. But we have plenty of examples of a developed siege tradition that stems from Persia, right? That comes, I think, out of an old contact between Medes and the Assyrians that dates all the way back into the Bronze Age, and that the Greeks benefit from that contact. I can't remember the name of the joint operation in Asia Minor that occurs in the Peloponnesian War, where the Persians are said, I think it's either Thucydides or Xenophon describes as operations. Maybe Murray, you can remember. Is it Cyzicus
Just
or
lost mine.
did you lose me? Hello?
For a second, just when you were saying the important thing. I think that's known as doing a Murray, but it wasn't me this time.
Oh no! Now the audio is getting choppy too. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Murray, there was a battle, and I can't remember it now. Was it Cyzicus? It was in Asia Minor. It was during the Peloponnesian War. It was a joint operation between Sparta and Persia, and it's specifically either Thucydides or Xenophon tells us that Persia specifically handled the siege engineering operation because they had the specialty skills. Does that ring a bell to you at all?
That does sound xenophonic.
It ended in a land battle, which
Right.
oh gosh,
Or probably Cyzicus sounds like one of those, but there's so many sieges at that point in that region.
Well, while you're saying
I see
that,
that.
I think the thing in the Roman army of the professional period, that from Augustus on, the praefectus castrorum was affected. That was one of his responsibilities, to have equipment, artillery, and then oversee sieges. So I would imagine that if you had several legions deployed, mentioning, for example, siege of Jerusalem, they must have actually had a tree structure where they picked one as being in charge, and then they would divide up the work. But there was a chief engineer to all intents and purposes. There had to be. I mean, you couldn't do this thing by accident. It had to be well thought out, because you're managing resources, you're managing headcount, and always the clock is ticking. What is the enemy going to do? Are they going to break out? Or what are they going to do?
It is, Murray, I just checked on the internet. It is Cyzicus 410 BC. And it reverses. So we have a successful siege with the Persians taking over operations. Then we have a naval defeat. And then we have that famous note from Mindarus.
Right.
We know not what to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even at the siege of Plataea, there's a 300 Spartans, not the 300 Spartans and not the Hippaeus, but a group of 300 Spartans who are clearly specialists in something, because they're there doing whatever was needed to be done in the siege engineering. So there seems to have been people, and Aeneas Tacticus again, and Cleus seems to have been known. We think he might be Aeneas the Stymphalian, who's mentioned in Xenophon's Hellenica, but clearly known to be someone who was good at running sieges. And I think again you get the idea that there are operatives within particular armies who are not necessarily they have a particular post, but that they are known to be good at doing a particular kind of thing. We get the idea of particular good miners, and obviously Rhodian slingers and Cretan archers, Thracian peltasts, all of those sorts of things come back again and again. But I think also there are communities who are good at building things in this regard and or destroying things in particular instances.
There's also the reputation of certain groups, but sometimes it's ill-founded, because you've got Vitruvius proposing that there's this the Carthaginians are these great innovators of siege equipment, and that he gives the explanations that they come up with the ram, the housing for the ram. He comes up with suggests that they innovate in terms of other measures that are clearly actually going back to the Assyrians and clearly can't be Carthaginians, etc. But again, it's just the perspective of the Romans on this thing.
Yeah, interesting. Like when in preparation for his invasion, Alexander gets Harpalus, his friend, to give him reading material, which is fascinating because he asks, go and find me some books. And he gives him poets, he gives him Aeschylus, Euripides, but he also gives him Philistus's history of the Syracusan wars in the late 5th, early 4th century, which is like, well, why would you need a Sicilian history if you're about to invade Asia Minor and the Persian Empire? But it does include accounts of sieges. So there seems to be the idea that because there's detailed siege descriptions, we think, in Philistus's history, that would have been useful for Alexander, knowing he was going into a region where he would need to besiege cities. So that idea.
Alexander's own main man in terms of sieges, Diades, I think it is, actually writes his own account of siege work, and of course he's the mastermind behind Tyre. So.
Right.
And also, Alexander's friendship with Harpalus doesn't ultimately work out.
Well, no, indeed.
It does last for a while until he sort of runs off. with a little bit of cash in just to tide him over.
Just a little bit. Just a little bit.
The mention of Tyre segues perfectly into Mark DeSantis.
Thank you very much. I think the important thing to know about, thank you for that wonderful intro. That's the best intro, 5.5 years on this podcast. That's the best one yet. I think that the Siege of Tyre, it's Alexander's greatest siege. I think it's undoubtedly one of the greatest sieges of the ancient world, something that ought to be studied by any student of ancient military history. I think the three things to put forward about the Siege of Tyre is this. Well, first, it was part of an integrated strategy that Alexander had to defeat the Persian navy by depriving the Persian fleet, which was actually mainly Phoenician crude and Phoenician ships, of operating bases. Ancient ships, they needed to return to port or at least beach themselves rapidly. They needed ports in order to resupply. If you could take away the ports, which were generally cities, then those fleets were not all that useful. It was more or less, if you capture airfields, air bases, warplanes aren't all that useful. Same theory there. And Alexander was so dedicated to this strategy that he actually disbanded his own fleet at the outset of this campaign. As he, in the aftermath of, he defeats the Persians at Granicus. He disbands his fleet. And he continues on with a purely land campaign. It turns out, though, that he has to bring some of his ships back to fight a war in the Aegean. But for the most part, his strategy is, as he's going down the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean, is to attack all of these cities, or at least take them with land forces. He comes to Tyre in January of 332. Now, he's defeated Darius at the Battle of Issus the previous November. Darius retreats back into the eastern half of the empire to rebuild his army. So Alexander is given a free hand to besiege Tyre. The Tyre itself, when we say the Siege of Tyre, there's Old Tyre, which is situated on an island off the coast. It's separated by a narrow strait of water, about 18 feet deep. It's very difficult to get at. But what Alexander does is showing, and this is the second point I like to make, showing his extraordinary determination. He is going to take Tyre despite the 150 feet high walls, no matter what. He loots New Tyre. That's the portion of the city that's now on the actual coast, the coastline, for rubble. Tosses that into the water and starts building a gigantic mole. The mole progresses, but the Tyrians show all sorts of energy and ingenuity in defending themselves. They bring a fire ship up that actually sets fire to the mole, destroys it. Alexander, not deterred, he starts building a second mole, which in order to bring his siege engines close to the city walls. Interestingly, it is not until, even though he has the moles come up to the Tyre city walls, built at great expense, it's not until he actually summons aid, naval help from various Phoenician cities, as well as from Cyprus. And he puts artillery and boarding bridges, siege towers, boarding bridges on top of these war galleys, that he's actually able to make a real impression on Tyre. Tyre is that strong that he has to find a weak spot in the walls on the seaward side, and with much bloodshed and cost in terms of just time and energy, he's finally able to make a breach and seize the city of Tyre. So while the moles loom large in the historical memory of the Siege of Tyre, what really made the siege feasible for Alexander was the naval aid that he got from various other parts of his conquered empire, mainly Phoenician cities and Cypriot cities too. The third point I like to make is this. The Siege of Tyre was taking place between January 332 and the end of July, early August of 332. So it was a very long time. And in all this time, there's no indication that Darius impeded Alexander in any way, that no aid came to the Tyrians, even though they were mounting an incredibly defiant defense of their city. And I think that that's something of a mystery. That is in the aftermath of the Issus, Alexander had a free hand to capture the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. After Tyre fell, he took Gaza and then went to Egypt. And he was not in any way troubled by Darius. In fact, would not meet Darius in a significant way until October of 331, close to over a full year after Tyre fell.
I think on the one hand, I think one thing you're missing here from that account is the aspect of Alexander himself, because I think the whole siege of Tyre is blown up by the sources a great deal, and I'm not saying it's not a great engineering feat to establish the moles which are still seen in the landscape today in terms of the joining of Tyre to the mainland. But Alexander, I mean, especially if you read Curtius, and he comes across as Alexander being Alexander, can't keep his concentration just on Tyre whilst the siege is going on. He has to be involved in other activities in the region, and he moves away. He leaves Perdiccas and Craterus in charge of this siege, and of course that's when, of course, you mentioned the fire ship coming in, the mole itself catching a flame. Things go backwards under his minor commanders. Alexander comes back, saves the day. He's the one who reignites the passion to the siege. He's the one who organizes for the reinforcements from the shipborne attacks, and also actually the mounting of siege equipment on ships to attack, because actually he realizes, as you say, it's not just a land attack that's going to win the day, etc. It's a very big Alexander ego trip, I think, on the one hand, that he, and it's interesting that this is the one that actually he comes back and he makes his selling point. If you think about Halicarnassus, he loses the focus and attention there as well, and decides to go off and do other things. He can't be bothered, leave some of his minor adjutants to look after that siege, etc. Gaza, on the other hand, it's sort of the success there is sort of sold on it, playing off Tyre. The equipment from Tyre is shipped down to Gaza afterwards, etc. Tyre is Alexander in himself.
And contrast that, for example, with Caesar at Alesia or Bibracte, and the man's on the spot the whole time. It's just interesting, is the commander, the generalizing style. So I think you're quite right that you can't separate the siege from the man to some degree.
But it's interesting because the Caesar, in a way, owns the mistakes at Alesia rather than Alexander, who's not present when the mistakes happen. Therefore, it's not his fault. But I think the other thing, of course, about Tyre is that up to Tyre, there's been sieges, but there has been this idea of cities opening their gates to him, which has, for the most part, worked. And when he comes to Tyre, there's this sort of determined effort to show that he will go through with what is necessary to take the city, as a way of, in a sense, propaganda to anyone else who resists. And for the most part, again, that works when he marches to Egypt. Most cities will open their gates to him because they don't want to have what happened to them happen, what happened to Tyre happen to them. So even though there are cities who continue to resist, for the most part, the populations of the Levant coast and Egypt open their gates to him and welcome him, which in a way, the long-term effects of Tyre, even though it's a long determined siege, are huge, because he doesn't have to really do the same long siege ever again.
And isn't this why you do it? In a sense, what you do is you pick on the bully in the playground, and if you can actually beat up the bully, then you're okay, right? Nobody else will.
Right.
But
I like that you did.
Right.
I was automatically going to prison movie, but you went to playground bully, so that's okay.
Yeah. Oh, well, there we go. All these could be wonderful movies, by the way. Sorry.
It's the opposite. It's interesting. We have two polar opposites here. We have the Brasidas example, where his kindness, his diplomacy, his offering cities a better deal results in cities across northern Greece opening their gates to him. In point of contradiction to Alexander's example of Tyre, you got to do one or the other, right? You got to make people think that either you're going to have it so good or so bad that not fighting is your best option.
Yeah.
Well, there's another nice segue, because we have to talk about the Assyrians. I mean,
Yeah.
the sort of, if you look at the history of what we know, at least of siege warfare, it's like, there's some going on in the second millennium BC, but it mostly is, the standard of just sit outside the city and wait till they give up. And then suddenly in the early first millennium come these Assyrians, and they bring the game up to a whole new level. And then what they do when they conquer a city, that they make these brilliant reliefs where they pretty much spell out for anyone who cares to see, this is what happens when you resist.
Well, isn't that why when we did the podcast on the Assyrians, we said they were basically not nice people? We wouldn't want to spend a night with them. We thought of all the ancient peoples, they were the despicable ones.
You wonder where they suddenly get all that energy and that knowledge to become so good at siege warfare. Is it just a matter of practice? They did a lot.
Well, probably, and I think it's also to do with what they're besieging, in the sense that I think in the magazine, Manning makes the point that these siege engines weren't these vast, overtowering towers that we think of, because the walls they're coming against aren't necessarily that tall. That they're actually a much smaller siege engine than we think. They're not these vast Demetrius Poliorcetes type towers. And then, of course, they're dealing with mud bricks, so they're dealing with picks that are picking apart the walls rather than battering through the walls. When we think of a battering ram, that's what we think. We think bashing down. But in fact, it seems to be a sharp point that picks apart mud brick and creates a hole through which you pour troops. And it seems to be, there's ladders, but there's also fire and even to the point of pickaxes to pull walls down. So I think that there's a great deal of destruction in Assyrian sieges rather than conquest, if that makes sense. Yes, they're trying to conquer peoples, but they will destroy your fortifications to keep you, pliable after you've been defeated. So it's an interesting.
To extend that point, I mean, your point, I think it boils down to this: is that the enemy was in cities, walled cities. What are you going to do when they close the gates? What happens next? You have to either just sit there and wait, like we've said before, and wait it out. And you're not really going to do that in a hot climate terribly badly. So you actually are going to take the offensive. And they must have, just through a process of experimentation, worked out this works, and we just keep building on this foundation of knowledge.
Yeah, well, of course, most of those cities have rivers running through them. So you're like, well, do we poison the water supply? Oh, God, well, then we poison the water supply. That sucks. That's bad for us too. Or do we divert the river, which happens in several ancient sieges, and probably the engineering works required to divert a river. It's like, well, actually, if we build these engines and ladders, we can use less manpower and less time and energy to build the siege equipment than it would take us to divert the river. So let's build the siege equipment and conquer the city rather than go through all of the other material.
Plus the bragging rights with these wonderful reliefs at the end of it. I mean, wow! and they last 2,500 years, 3,000 years.
I think
I can't make it.
Sorry.
No.
I think when we consider, why are the Assyrians good at sieges? There's also a lot we don't know about ancient cultures at the cultural level, what the culture prioritizes. There's definitely, as we examine ancient warfare, there are cultural propensities for specific weapons classes, combat roles, and some of this has obvious sources like Thessalian horsemen and Boeotian cavalry. Right, these are plains where horse rearing is good. And easy to do. But other things like Agrianians' affinity for the javelin or, Rhodians' affinity for the sling are less apparent. Is this external sources ascribing this to a culture or not? But when I look at, for example, Persian aristocratic love of gardening, which is well documented in Herodotus, that, this is a thing that Persians love. This is a cultural mainstay, that if you grow up Persian, you're raised to love raising plants and love gardens. And I wonder if there are military applications for this as well. An example I can think of in my own life is my family. I grew up in this family where fighting is not allowed. You know, good people in my family become lawyers, they become doctors, they become white-collar professionals. They do not work with their hands. They certainly do not go to war. And so my decision to join the military, my decision to go into law enforcement, I'm to this day viewed by my family as this weird black sheep. And there's no reason for that. There's no, it's a cultural mainstay. And this goes back generations. We're talking hundreds of people. So I almost wonder if there are things lost to us in the sources in Assyrian culture that somehow lend to that, I don't know, a love of mathematics, a love of construction, and a social acceptance among the military aristocracy to value and pursue those characteristics. I understand it's unprovable, but it's an interesting thing to speculate on.
I suspect they're all trapped up in those cuneiform tablets. One of the articles I wrote for ancient history was that they're using machine learning now to try and translate these. It's an enormous amount that we still don't know because we haven't translated the majority of these tablets. So you're right, Mike.
It is interesting. You've got the suggestion as well in terms of coming back to the more classical Greek period. The idea that the hoplites would not be going in for getting involved in any of the sapper work and digging what was I saying? The trenches and mines and whatnot. It's dirty work. It's not the work of a hoplite. It's more the work of a slave, etc. So on the one hand, then you've got also mining communities where you get references to the copper mining communities saying yes, they're actually got great sappers that are expert underminers for any siege works, etc. So it is all dependent, as you say, on the community and the makeup of the community and the outlook of what their military elite are minded to do.
Mind you, at Pylos, Demosthenes tries to ask the two. So Pylos is a private citizen, and he goes with Sophocles and Eurybiades, Eurymedon, the two generals, the two strategoi, and he can't convince them at Pylos that they should fortify Pylos. They're like, no, we're heading off. Do what you like. But then inclement weather keeps them at Pylos, and it's the soldiers themselves who are bored because they're not doing anything, and they go, "What, you want us to put some stones up? Okay, let's do that." So they basically build the Pylos fortifications very quickly because they had nothing else to do. And it's Demosthenes who appeals to them basically through charisma as a private citizen. And Demosthenes' career up to that point is fascinating because he's had a disaster in Aetolia where he loses 120 hoplites. And Thucydides makes the point that these aren't just 120 hoplites; these are the cream of their generation. And so he refuses to return to Athens in 426 because he's done so badly that clearly he's going to get put to death if he goes back. But then he manages through with some Araucanians and wins the Battle of Olpae against the Spartans that completely restores his reputation. So he goes back to Athens and he's like, "Oh, you're brilliant." And so he goes off on this private expedition. He's given permission by the Athenian demos to have 40 ships at his disposal as a private citizen to do what he feels best around the coast of the Peloponnese, which is what leads to Pyloson's Facteria, even though he actually doesn't hold any official rank. So in that case, it's interesting that the soldiers, the hoplites, do build the siege, the walls, because they had nothing else to do with their time, which is a fascinating kind of reversal of that idea that was below them. It was like, "Wow, we're here. Let's make a siege work."
There's a perfect modern example of this that we can relate directly to the ancient world. I think I speak for all of us in that, like for me, the conception of being a man, you're going to be a manly man when you grow up. You make money, right? You manage money, you invest. Like you're a person who knows how money works. You earning money is good, and having wealth is good, and running your own business. Like these are manly attributes. At least that's how I was raised. And all of my friends, most of the men of my generation I know. Could you imagine saying that to a medieval person, a medieval military elite or an ancient elite, that being a merchant, that making money was how you proved your worth as a man? That's insane, right? Like it's completely crazy. I think any ancient or medieval warrior would look at me as a man who invests in markets and doesn't have a slave do it for me, doesn't have my wife do it for me. Like, that's crazy, right? And to us, it's just how we were raised. So it's a great example of that, of things that we can accept as a cultural norm that are completely different in the ancient world. And I can't say that, of course, this is the case in Assyrian siegecraft. The only reason I bring it up is that I feel like there are the cultural picture that may be fueling some of these military decisions because of the inability to translate these cuneiform tablets, as Lindsay said, it's we can't know.
Yeah, good, because your model of manhood was really attacking me, because I'm unmanly in all of those making money, investing money, knowing how to handle money. Wow!
And you just told us you moved and kept your apartment in New York City, so you're investing in extra land. Very much an Asian thing to do.
Unless it's
But of
plastic
course,
and lead
there was
soldiers, I'm failing.
But also, though, there is a level of, shall we say, optics to this. So, for example, you transpose that argument to the Roman society, and absolutely, the patricians, the senators, were actually not allowed to actually have financial investments. But oh boy, did they! And they, of course, they had connections with the equites who actually did this, and the equites actually went on to be like an officer class. So I think there's a certain amount of we can't be seen to be do this, but oh boy, do we like money.
It comes back. There's I can't remember which siege it is in Greece that they actually are able to detect the mining activity of the attacking army coming underneath their walls by actually placing their bronze shields on the ground, and because the local miners had actually worked out that the bronze resonates with the mining activities underneath, and it's just that wonderful idea of it's not the hoplites, it's not the military elite actually coming up with the city saving technique. It's actually the salt of the earth miners who are actually saying, hey, we got some knowledge that can actually give us a bit of advantage here.
And I suspect that's probably how most warfare is fought. I mean, isn't it the adage that you can make the plan, but as soon as you put the plan into action, it just falls apart because the guys actually
survives. No plan survives contact with the enemy. Every single member of every single military learns that day.
There we go. Yeah. So the troop with the spear or the AK-47, whatever your weapon of choice is, I mean, is going to deal with whatever contingencies and come up with solutions.
Well, I think we talked about that. It's certainly not talked to death, and we probably could do some more. But today we're not gonna. So I think I'm going to leave you all with that was the last one for this year. See you soon in the new year. Hopefully under slightly improved circumstances or a different outlook, where we may be able to have maybe we could do a live podcast sometime. Wouldn't that be a thing?
That would be wonderful.
Ooh.
See other human beings. That would be great.
Right. Thank you all. I'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.